Hi, my name's Sarah Robbins, and I am the Vice President of Client Relations and Sales here at Vanderbloemen. And today I wanted to talk about replacing a long-tenured pastor. So this is something we've had a whole lot of experience with here for so many reasons, but one of the big reasons is that we're currently in a season in our world where we have a lot of baby boomers who are wrapping up long tenures as pastors in churches who have served really well. But now they're moving on, they're retiring, they're moving on to something new. And in that, we have seen several threads, commonalities around these replacements and about these transitions and these searches that we do. So I wanted to talk about four big ones that we see that could be a challenge or could pose some nuances when you're working through the transition with your church, and kind of hit on some of those. So the first one is when you're considering the senior pastor's transition and you're replacing a long tenured pastor, you have to consider that current pastor or the outgoing pastor's legacy. What does that mean? Well, that means is we've had a current pastor in place for 30 years, and this pastor has been a huge proponent of missions. Or we've had a pastor in place for 25 years, and he has made big inroads in the local shelter. Or our current pastor that's been here 15 years has done very strong exegetical preaching, and that's what our congregation is used to. So every single pastor is going to leave a legacy, be it something that they do, some sort of characteristic about them, something that they care deeply about, and that impacts the church. When someone is there leading at the helm for that long, the church is going to permeate through the entire church. So take time to think through, okay, what is it about our pastor? Let's use the missions, for example. We've had 15% of our budget goes towards missions. We're supporting several missionaries or missions organizations, and we have a missions week, and we have all of these sort of things. So you want to be cautious that you don't go look for a new pastor that doesn't care about missions at all. Maybe your church wants to adjust away from missions a little bit, and that's great, that's fine. But you need to be aware of what your church has been doing for the last 15, 20, 30 years with that pastor leading. So it's not too much of a knee-jerk reaction, or you don't lose people, or there just gets muddiness around where you're headed as a church. So consider their legacy. That's the first one. The second one is consider the spouse and family. Sounds obvious, but if you've had a senior pastor for 20 years, you've had a senior pastor spouse for 20 years. They are the same, they are a couple. It's a package deal. So you need to think through, what has that pastor's spouse been like to our church? Is it our pastor's spouse has led women's ministry for the last 20 years, or our pastor's spouse has focused on leading her home, or our pastor's spouse works outside of the home? It's not the preeminent thing, but again, it's something that people look over. We've had 30 years of the same pastor spouse who has done ministry in this way with our church. So you need to think through that. What are we used to? What are we going to expect in our next pastor's spouse? It may not surprise you to hear that sometimes new pastors get in place and they realize that there was expectations put on their spouse that they had no idea in the interview process. So think through that on your own end, so you're not surprising your next pastor or your pastor spouse, so that you're ready for it. So the third one is the new pastor's compensation. I remember sitting in a meeting with a search committee a couple years ago. They were replacing a 25-year pastor, and they looked at me and said, we paid him X amount of money annually plus benefits. So we know that we aren't going to be hiring someone who's his age, so we'll probably only have to pay them X, Y, Z. It was a much lower number, and they felt like, well, we're hiring someone new, someone younger, we likely aren't going to have to pay him that much money. The trick about it is this church had not done a good job at keeping up with cost of living increases and increasing this pastor's salary as the church attendance and budget increased. So it was a big shock for them, for me to present numbers and charts and graphs to show them, you're probably going to have to pay close to the same for this new pastor, maybe a little bit more depending on how much experience you're looking for. So take a look. We would recommend looking at your salary every single year anyways, especially if you've had a big change in your budget or your attendance, or if you've had a big change in your org chart. But take a look at the salary and make sure that you're keeping up with that. We get the logic of thinking, oh, I won't have to pay that much for this new person because they're younger. Remember, we don't pay based on age, we pay based on experience, number one. But we've got to consider the fact that have we been keeping up with what this pastor should be making? Cost of living adjustments even in your area is a big piece to the puzzle. And then the fourth one, which is kind of tricky, so walk with me here, is you have to consider generations. I mentioned at the top of this that we have a whole bunch of baby boomers who are transitioning out of the pastoral role right now. They're retiring, they're semi-retiring and doing other ministry, but it's a whole generation of people who lived and worked a certain way. Everyone's unique, everyone's individual. But we get calls all the time and talk to our churches who say, hey, Pastor George was with us for 30 years. We want to find our next 30-year guy. And while we think that's a wonderful thing and we would love that to happen, it's something that churches and people aren't really thinking through the logic of who's coming behind Pastor George. So we have two generations coming behind these baby boomers. We have the Gen X and then we have the millennials. We talk about millennials all the time. I'm tired of talking about millennials. I'm sure you are too. But these two different generations don't function like baby boomers do. Also, we don't have a whole lot of data on what they're going to do yet because they are younger. So if you're looking for someone in their 40s, early 50s, in their 30s, late 30s, early 20s, you have to consider the fact that these two generations, we're not positive, but we don't feel super confident that they're going to be 30-year pastors. They might. That would be fantastic. But I think it would be really, really wise for churches to realign their expectations for what's coming down the pipeline. So how do we see success in that? How do we see success with a pastor that stays 5 years? We need to look maybe less at how long is the pastor staying and what is the pastor accomplishing through God. And that's going to be, did we grow in discipleship? Did we grow in numbers? Did we grow in budget? Growth isn't always, pennies and people. But did we grow deeper in our community connections? Did we grow deeper as disciples following Christ? It's not a bad thing at all for a church to have a 5-7 year pastor that does spectacular kingdom things in that community and in that congregation, and then move on to do something else. And then you bring another pastor in for a little while. Change is hard. We like having consistency, but I think we all need to be prepared for who it is that's coming down the pipeline and what that's going to look like. So those are 4 things that are practical that we hope are helpful for you guys to think through. If there's anything else in this realm that we can talk to you about, we'd love to. This is right up our alley. We do hundreds of these every year, and we hope that this will be a guide as you try and navigate this next season.